Hi there, Mr. Boy here with the Egypt Game. Today's chapter is 22, Gains and Losses. Things had scarcely had time to quiet down after April's narrow escape when Christmas vacation arrived. The first few days of vacation, the members of the Egypt Gang were pretty busy with family things like shopping and trips and relatives, but now and then some of their paths crossed and they stopped to discuss things in general, and the Egypt situation in particular. That situation didn't look good at all. The day after all the excitement, Toby had drifted down the alley just to look things over, and he had found the land of Egypt boarded up. Someone had replaced the loose board and nailed it into place with big long nails, and some fresh strands of barbed wire had been strung across the top. The consensus of opinion was pretty much, that's that. Egypt was gone and lost forever, and there was no use thinking about it. It was a terrible loss. As a matter of fact, the Egyptians hadn't really realized until then just how great Egypt had been. It had been a terrific game, full of excitement and mystery and way out imagining. But it had been a great deal more than that. It had been a place to just get away to, a private lair, a secret seclusion meant to be shared with best friends only, a life unknown to grown-ups and lived by kids alone. And now, all of a sudden, it was gone. But the other Egyptians didn't blame April and Marshall for its loss. After all, they hadn't done it on purpose, and the way it turned out, they had really done all the kids in the neighborhood a big favor, because now that the murderer had been caught, everybody was being allowed a lot more freedom. The whole neighborhood had benefited, really. There was only Egypt to mourn. It was a few days after the beginning of vacation that April decided to go down and pay a visit to the professor, or Dr. Huddleston, as people were beginning to call him. The visit had been her grandmother's suggestion in the first place, but April agreed that it was a good idea. As she started downstairs, she considered stopping by for Melanie, but she decided against it. It was better to go alone on such personal errands, and she really did have something very personal to say. But if April had imagined that it would be easy to have a quiet, personal interview with the professor in his lonely store, she was mistaken. There were 2 or 3 browsers just looking around. The professor was wrapping something up for a customer, and over by the window, Elizabeth's mother, Mrs. Chung, was dusting some figurines and arranging them in the display case. The whole store looked different, cleaner and brighter and not so cluttered. April was amazed. For one thing, Mrs. Chung had been working at a cleaner's over on the other side of town, and April hadn't heard anything about a change. But then Elizabeth had been visiting in San Francisco with her cousins the last few days, so April wasn't really up to date on the Chung family news. "Hi, Mrs. Chung," April said. "Do you work here now?" "Hello, April. Yes, I do. I just began on Monday." It didn't look as if the professor was going to be free very soon, so April squatted down to look at the tiny, foreign-looking statues that Mrs. Chung was arranging very artistically on a velvet cloth. "I think this would be a neat place to work," April said. "I'd sure like it." "It's a very interesting place to work," Mrs. Chun said, and it's wonderful being so close to home. I think I'm going to like it very much. Dr. Huddleston is planning to do some traveling soon to look for new things to sell, and I'll be in charge while he's gone." Mrs. Chung smiled delightedly, and April noted that her dimples were just like Elizabeth's. "There sure are a lot of people in here," April mentioned, just to make conversation. Mrs. Chung smiled. "I guess it's been that way all the time lately. Poor Dr. Huddleston's almost worn himself out taking care of them. Of course, some of them are just curious because of all the publicity and everything in the paper, but a lot of them are neighborhood people who are feeling ashamed about suspecting him when he was innocent. They come in here and buy things they don't even need, just to ease their consciences." April grinned. "I'll bet the people who signed that petition Mr. Schmidt sent around buy them most of all." "No doubt," Mrs. Chung said. "I've heard that Mr. Schmidt is selling out. This whole thing must have been very hard on him." "Well, I don't feel sorry for him," April said. "I'll bet he had a notion that his cousin was the murderer, but he didn't want to believe it. And that was why he was so sure with the professor. That's what my grandmother says." "I guess that's something we'll never know," Mrs. Chung said. She nodded towards the professor. "I think Dr. Huddleston is free now if you want to go see him." The professor shook April's hand, and he smiled ever so slightly when she said, "I came to say thanks a lot for saving my life." He looked pretty much as April remembered him, and his voice was still gravelly and grave, but he seemed younger somehow and more lively. "You're most welcome," he said, "but I'm not at all sure I was responsible. I feel sure your young friend would have found some other means to aid you if I had not been available." "Oh, you mean Marshall?" April said. "Yeah, he's something, isn't he?" The professor agreed that he certainly was. And then there was an uncomfortable pause, and April, for once, was at a loss for words. At last the professor said, "I have something here you might like to see." He took down a small box and opened it carefully on the counter. There were two objects in it, a flat piece of marble with dim hieroglyphics on it, and a small head of a glowing milky white. "Ooh," April said, "that's alabaster, isn't it?" "Very good," the professor said. "You're quite an Egyptologist." "And the other is a bit of marble facing from the wall of a temple." They examined the pieces together, and the professor told April all sorts of interesting things about them. He also said that they had once belonged to his wife, and that was an interesting idea in itself, to think that the lonely old professor had once had a wife. In the course of the conversation, it occurred to April that this would be a good time to mention all the things that had been left in the land of Egypt. The 6 Egyptians had thought about them many times and wondered if the professor intended to give them back. Toby, in particular, hated to use Toth. He was a sort of keepsake. 2 or 3 times she was on the verge of mentioning it, but each time she lost her nerve. After all, they had put the things on the professor's property, and maybe that meant they were his now. And you just can't go around demanding things of someone who's just saved your life. But except for the fact that the professor didn't offer to give back their things, it was a very successful visit. As April was getting ready to go, she said, "Well, goodbye, and thanks again, Dr. Huddleston. My grandmother says that your name is Dr. Julian Huddleston. Are you really a doctor?" "Not a medical doctor, a doctor of philosophy, a PhD. I once taught at the university, but that was a long time ago. I'd be most pleased if you and your friends continued to call me the professor. I'd prefer it, in fact." "So do I," April said. "Okay, goodbye, Professor, and thanks again." When April got back to the apartment, there was a letter waiting for her. It was from her mother. It was the first letter April had had for over a month. Of course, Dorothea would probably have written if she had known about April's narrow escape, but she hadn't known. For some reason, April hadn't told her, and she'd asked Caroline not to either. When Caroline had asked April why, she just said, "I don't know. What's the use? It's too late now." But today, there was a letter and an invitation. "Darling, Nick and I am planning on spending 3 or 4 days in Palm Springs over Christmas. We want you to hop on a plane and fly down to us. There'll be swimming and sunning and lots of fun. We'll meet you at the airport if you let us know when and where. We're dying to see you again. Love, Dorothea." April took the letter to her room. She sat down by the window and reread it 3 times and felt around inside herself for reactions. She found some all right, both good and bad, but not nearly as much either way as she would have expected. Not as much happiness to be asked, and not nearly as much anger to be asked, so late and for so little. After a while, she got out some paper and wrote an answer. Then she took both letters and went looking for Caroline. She found her in the kitchen sewing sequins on a Christmas stocking made of felt. Without saying anything, April put the letters down in front of her. "Dear Dorothea," April's letter said, "thank you for inviting me to Palm Springs. It sounds like lots of fun. But Grandma and I have our plans all made for Christmas Eve, and I have a date to spend part of Christmas Day with my friend Melanie, so I guess I can't make it this time. Love, April. P.S. You should see our tree. We decorated it yesterday, and it's great." Caroline was such a quiet person, it was hard sometimes to know what she was thinking. But lately, April usually thought she could tell. Right then, Caroline only smiled and said, "That's a very nice letter, dear," and bent her head back down over the sequins. And the sun coming in the little stained glass section of the breakfast room window made her smooth gray hair look just like a pigeon's wing. And that's the end of that chapter.